This is your World War III update. In the next 24 hours, we enter the most dangerous period in human history. In the next few hours, a Russian delegation will make its way to the United States. This procession has already begun. But the president, the prime minister, and the speaker of the Duma, the top three officials in the Russian government, including the foreign minister, the finance minister, and the defense minister, are all going to be on American soil at the same time with the nuclear briefcase in tow. Won't that be a sight to see both Trump and Putin standing next to each other with their bodyguards both holding their nuclear briefcases? Now, why this is so important, I'm going to get into that in just a moment, because there is a trifecta of conditions that have to be satisfied in order for an attack to be imminent. And we certainly have two of three of those fulfilled. The third is obscured by a masquerade. Let me get into that in a moment. Just understand that the Russian Doomsday radio is currently emitting messages, coded messages, that are very similar to that preceded the Ukraine war. Now, it is not unprecedented. We've heard this happen on multiple occasions in the run-up to the Orezhnik missile launch, and usually in the run-up to any major big arrow maneuver by Russia or Ukraine, or potentially relating to nuclear drills. We will see these messages being emitted. Now, I think this is a reminder to the West, and it's putting them on notice, that indeed, whoever is holding down the fort at home, which likely is the head of the Security Council in Russia, Dmitry Medvedev, he is the one currently with his finger on the button once all of those Russian officials leave the country. Now, yesterday I talked about the decapitation strike variables and how all the data was pointing towards military feasibility, that there is this Goldilocks zone, this window of vulnerability that exists, that is going to be optimal at some period of time, which makes an attack very likely. What I failed to mention in that video upon further reflection is that there are other factors that come into play. Just because something is militarily feasible, like just because NATO is approaching this Goldilocks zone where conducting a decapitation strike on Russia is as feasible as it's ever going to be, meaning that the window eventually closes for a multitude of reasons, be they geopolitical, economic, or military. It's like a 0 day. If you don't use it, there's a chance that the vulnerability will be exposed. So we have military feasibility, arguably, at least north of 75% of the way there in terms of NATO's tightening of the noose around Russia. Again, I'm not going to go into great depth about that. I did a 12 to 15 minute video about it yesterday that breaks it all down, why militarily NATO is primed, locked and loaded to do a full-scale decapitation strike on Russia, and that this exodus out of the country by the Russian leadership is a very rare instance where you're going to have the guy who is ostensibly, at least for the time being, in charge of the nuclear codes, going to be in a position whereby if they wanted to, they could prevent those those transmissions of that information from being relayed, utilizing electronic warfare or having some sort of a suppression of communications. They could inhibit the ability for Russia, the Russian leadership, Vladimir Putin, to basically get the message back to the motherland to fire the nukes. Okay? Now, I don't know how they would do it. Would they use some sort of electronic disturbance suppression system? I'm sure something exists to make sure that the nuclear briefcase wouldn't work. This is a very rare instance of military feasibility. Now, could the conditions be optimized further? Absolutely. There's many more things that could happen that would weaken Russia's defenses and increase the likelihood of a successful NATO offensive, minimizing retaliatory capability and second strike capability on behalf of the Russians. However, there's two other main components that we have to take into account here. One is imperative, and that is the necessity of it. Is it necessary for NATO to attack Russia from their point of view within the paradigm through which they view and understand the world? Arguably, yes, it most certainly is, because of course we're talking about a plan for global domination where we view ourselves in the most sanctimonious light possible, and we view ourselves as extolling the virtues of freedom and democracy, and thus we should be the global hegemons in our minds. And these other tyrannical authoritarian governments are also vying for power. So not the mandate, but the imperative is there. There is a war for resources, which is being waged right now, and we need to win that war for resources. It's the game theory component. The imperative is arguably always present, and it's especially present right now with the rise of BRICS, the rise of China, and of course Russia being China's literal pipeline or energy source. They need to be taken out in terms of, if you're of this belief. Okay, so we have military feasibility and we have the imperative. The last thing is, and this is very important, people need to understand this because it just clicked for me. You need the mandate. You need the political will to do it. And when all these three things align, so political will is comprised of, not only do you need a person who is willing to go the distance, but you also need it to be popular. And arguably, it is not popular to go to war with Russia, but that could be altered by a mere false flag event or something. And honestly, this is one of those things where the political will on behalf of whoever is in the executive seat at the time is more important than whether or not it's going to be a popular idea. But there has to be some degree of public mandate in order for war or an attack to take place. Now, war is never popular. So we've seen throughout the Iraq War, throughout the Vietnam War, this mandate thing is very loose. You only need, you don't need a majority. You just need enough support. And it's not like 51%. It's, a very fringe element could form a substantive mandate that would permit you to go to war. So we have those three things. Now, once these three things become apparent, that means an attack is almost certain. If you have a mandate to go to war, if you have the imperative to go to war, the necessity of that war being fought, and if you have the feasibility encompassing, of course, the fact that you have the resources and you have the military assets forward deployed in the right locations. If you have all of those things, an attack is imminent. Now, if you know that, and if you know that those three criteria have been fulfilled, chances are so does your adversary. Thus, what they're going to attempt to do is some sort of preclusive operation, which will seek to preempt your attack. In fact, if you look at the beginning of the Ukraine war, remember, it was Russia who claimed that NATO had a mandate, an imperative, and military feasibility to enter into the Donbass, that the Ukrainians were about to attack. So what did Vladimir Putin do? In that classic, overused phrase by Vladimir Putin, if you know a fight is coming, you throw the first punch. Well, how do you know a fight is coming? You've basically checked all those three boxes. Now, the question is, how many of those boxes have we checked? We've most certainly checked feasibility. We've most certainly checked the imperative component. Now, in terms of mandate, this is where the political facade comes into play. And this is where you have both sides trying to assuage the other and fool them into believing that there is no mandate for war, because they know that once that criteria is fulfilled, then there is a good chance that the other side is going to do a preemptive strike. So you have to commit to this dog and pony show smokescreen in order to make it appear as though you are engaged in the diplomatic dialogue and sincerely committed to it. This is why throughout all the Russian media channels, despite all of the things that the United States has done to Russia, like blow up their pipelines, arm the Ukrainians with billions of dollars of weapons to kill hundreds of thousands of Russian people, attempted to completely destroy their economy, while Ukraine day after day continues to attrit and strike their oil refineries and gas infrastructure on a daily basis, that the Russians are entertaining fantasies like we're going to build a tunnel to Alaska and we're going to engage in economic cooperation in the Arctic. All of this is pure fantasy. This is all fiction. This is acting. The reason why they're doing this is because they don't want to let on that they know what the United States is up to. Because if they did, then that means that the three criteria would be fulfilled and an attack would be imminent. So both sides have to play along, because this is the only ingredient that isn't apparent. And so this is where you have what a friend of mine calls the tango of the daggers. Okay, it's like a dance, but both people are carrying a knife behind their back. And it's just a simple, and I can't really articulate the ways in which you would engage in this dance, and it would be a cooperative endeavor to the point when there was a brief window of opportunity. And this is the thing with all of these, when all of these three things are aligned, they're only in alignment for a certain period of time. And if you don't seize upon it, then you will effectively lose the initiative. You'll lose a golden opportunity, because when those three things are aligned, there's a good chance for success. So this is why they're likely going to execute when those three things align. So if, and here's the real danger, if and when these talks don't amount to anything, that's when things get scary, because it's when the mandate starts to emerge. And we've seen it starting to emerge when Trump was being more hawkish. And this is when we've seen the military buildup and the nuclear brinkmanship buildup. When the mandate was, Russia is not being nice. Russia keeps bombing, civilian places with civilians, and there's too much collateral damage, and yada, yada, yada. Well, once we conclude these meetings, which are, I'm not really entirely sure as to what the purpose of it is. I believe that it is the final, diplomatic facade and reconciling the mandate and seeing as to whether or not there can be some movement on this, because it's militarily feasible for NATO in the sense that, yes, they will incur the wrath of Russian retaliation, but they're poised to be in a position to minimize that. And that is, of course, going to be that optimal window. Now, again, could it be optimized further? It's possible, but the longer they let it go on, it runs the risk that Russia gains the upper hand and it no longer is militarily feasible. So this is why, and a lot of this will have to do with intelligence, the whereabouts of various Russian leaders at any given time. So much of it is going to be intelligence-based, and including what assets are on the ground behind enemy lines at any given time. But when those three things are fulfilled, I would say war is inevitable. At this point in time, it's politically untenable for Trump to just, go to nuclear war with Russia. But that's not to say that something can't happen. And in the fallout of these talks, if Trump says, okay, we tried, we met with them, we did all this stuff and they still persisted, that's when it does become politically defensible. And all of those criteria are fulfilled, and then the Russians will see that and they'll say, okay, a strike is imminent, we got to do something. And so every time you see a new leg up the escalation ladder, with that punctuated escalation, it's a statement from one side to the other that the three criteria are approaching fulfillment, and we are interdicting whatever it is you're planning. This is why they launched the Orezhnik, as a demonstration to the West that if you launch long-range missiles into Moscow, this is what we're going to do. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens in the fallout of these talks. And yes, you might say I'm being cynical, but I see no reason not to be at this point, because everything we are seeing in Russian media supports this hypothesis that they are just playing along to create the illusion of naivete so that the West doesn't get paranoid and execute the plan sooner than later. I simply cannot believe for the life of me that you have such a high-ranking delegation leaving the country, going into a place where they can't control whether or not a communication is going to be able to go back to the mothership. Because again, there could be some sort of electronic warfare that basically renders communication inoperable within this space. And now, again, this might all sound crazy, but if the criteria are fulfilled, then that's it. All right? So something to keep in mind anyways. In terms of this Doomsday radio broadcast, the UVB-76 Doomsday radio in Russia just rebroadcast a coded sequence nearly identical to January 6th to 10th in 2022, weeks before the Russian-Ukraine invasion. The words sent are words that I cannot pronounce, should I even bother. Liekopspas, Shleshslauslab, Druznost, Kerner, Ryushny. And some of these words are meaningful and some is just gibberish, right? Only change verse 2022 is the number of groups preceding each word. So these are coded emergency action messages which are intended to communicate either strategic objectives or military commands, especially in the case of, all-out nuclear war. UVB-76 basics, a constant buzz, is typically what you would hear on this frequency, and occasional voice codes. This is widely believed to be Russian military intel for secret emergency orders, and it's been active since the late 1970s. The repeat has ignited speculation among analysts and radio hams on SIGINT forums and Telegram. The bottom line here is that the pattern is alarming, but it's not necessarily proof of imminent action because, of course, correlation does not equal causation. Now, just imagine you're Medvedev, right? And you got your finger on the button, you got your hands on the reins of power, or whoever is in charge. And you're waiting for the crew to get back, and you're just sitting there looking at the clock, waiting, wondering if the messages that you're receiving are real or not, right? Because they could be intercepted. There could be deep fakes. And this is the other element, that information plays a big role here in terms of the whole communication and command and control, especially when you are outside the boundaries of a information airwaves that you have total control over. So if you're Russia, you don't even know technically if what you're seeing is real or if it's just a fabrication. If Putin walked into that building and everything from that point forward was a fabrication, whilst the West covertly prepared a decapitation strike. Now, again, I'm not saying this is going to happen, and I'm not losing sleep over this. However, I am staying close to home and I'm staying tuned, because if there ever was going to be a Goldilocks zone for SHTF to occur, it's in the next 24 hours. I mean, this is it. Ironically, it's also at a potential turning point. And this is sort of the paradox, is that if you want to achieve peace, you have to put yourself in incredibly vulnerable, risky situations. Now, hopefully, something emerges from this meeting. I can't see how it could, because I think it's all theater, and I think it's both sides trying to play the other. So that's my assessment of that situation anyways. I don't think that, if there was going to be anything inked tomorrow, that we would have had some deals brokered in advance. They don't even have like a tentative, agreement, a tentative outline. And of course, without Ukraine there, it's a non-starter, even though the US is Ukraine, or, their legal guardian. Now, in terms of the nuclear briefcase, Russia's top 3 officials, the president, the PM, and the Duma speaker, will all be abroad at the same time. That's insane. That's insane, especially considering it's not like they're going to the Middle East. They're going to the United States of all places. Putin remains fully in charge. Now, this was an article that was written by RIA Novosti, another Russian state-sponsored media source. Putin remains fully in charge and always in touch, even when traveling. Okay, again, that can be intercepted, and deepfakes are very good at that level. And if you're privy to all the compute power in the world, we marvel at the VO3 and Sora, and well, maybe not so much Sora, but these video generations, Midjourney, AI video generation tools. That's just what they give us with the limited morsel of compute that we're allotted. If the government wants, and of course this is why Sam Altman with Stargate is in so good with the White House, because all of that's going to be leveraged for information warfare. And they could make it seem as though Vladimir Putin was sending a message back when he in fact wasn't. So this is crazy stuff, man. If you really think about how, close we are at this point in time, really, really scary. I hope we can get this resolved before AI really takes off, because there's still that uncanny aspect of it. But I mean, really, with enough compute, there is no uncanny valley. It looks and feels and is indistinguishable from real life. Formally, it's the president in terms of the practical hierarchy of command. It is the president, the prime minister, the parliamentary speakers. In practice, no major decisions, especially nuclear, happen without Putin's approval. Okay, so what does this mean? If you're NATO, you're seeing this opportunity. That means Putin might not be able to get the signal to Russia to send the nuclear weapons, right? To do a retaliatory strike. You see how tempting this would be for them? I'm not saying it's going to happen. I'm just saying the stars only align like this once every 75,000 years. In terms of the military input, the defense minister, general staff may influence steps, but the final word is with Vladimir Putin. Apparently, recently, and I remember reading about this at one point, that the Russians had allotted more of the control over the nuclear weapons to their generals. And I think this was an update to their nuclear doctrine, which is fairly recent, that the generals actually have more autonomy with respect to utilizing nuclear weapons. Putin is traveling to Alaska to meet Trump on the Ukrainian settlement. Prime Minister Mishustin in Kyrgyzstan at the moment, why they would have him out of the country. And Duma Speaker Volodin in Pyongyang. Okay, so those two guys are not going to Russia, but they're out of the country, right? And then you have Lavrov, you have, what's his name, Belousov, the defense minister. And so those are, some pretty heavy hitters as well. And I'm sure they're somewhere down the hierarchy of command, not too far. Zarylov has warned that against any illusions that power passes to someone else, Kremlin released pre-summit footage of Vladimir Putin. So Russian state media is saying, don't worry, the president is in control. Why they felt the need to publish an article like that is slightly disconcerting. Now, in terms of the damage that's been conducted and waged against Russian oil refineries, remember there was supposed to be a ceasefire against infrastructural targets in both Russia and Ukraine. Well, here's what's happened in the past week. That was one of the first things that came about when Trump started this negotiation blitz back in January, is that they agreed to stop targeting infrastructure for a month. Well, here's what happened in the past 12 days. Ukrainian kamikaze drones have damaged or disabled 5 oil refineries in Russia. This is on top of the dozens of attacks against their oil and gas infrastructure. They struck the Ryazan oil refinery on the 2nd, which processes 13 million tons of oil per year, 5% of Russia's total processed volume. Then they bombed the Novokoybishevsk. Oil refinery, which processes 8.3 million tons of oil annually. Then they hit the Afipsky. God. Maybe it's easier when you look at it in Cyrillic. Hit the Afipsk oil refinery, which processes 7 million tons of oil annually. The Saratov oil refinery was bombed by Ukrainian kamikaze drones. This refinery processes 7 million tons of oil per year. And just yesterday, an attack was carried out on Volgograd oil refinery, which processes 15 million tons of oil per year. All right, so Russia's ability, this is why there's a gasoline ban there right now. Now, Russia claims that they've destroyed the facility that Ukraine was using to produce their ballistic missiles that have the capability to hit Moscow. And they claim that they wiped out that facility with 30 Shahed drones. Apparently, there's some footage that is circulating that is showing multiple explosions and cook-offs at these facilities that allegedly were building these ballistic missiles, which potentially would have given Ukraine a capability that Russia has had. It would be, I guess, the equivalent would be like the Iskander missile system, if I'm not mistaken. And they've claimed that that's been destroyed. Now, these types of claims have been made before. Maybe it's been decimated but not destroyed. Who knows? Anyways, what a crazy time. I hope you got something out of this video. If you did, please like, comment, and subscribe. Everything that I talk about today are thoughts that original ideas and thoughts that I've come up with in terms of this mandate, feasibility, imperative idea. Maybe there's another way of describing it in military speak, but I do put a lot of work into these videos, and if you subscribe and like and comment, that goes a long way. Thanks for watching, my friends. Take care. Canadian Prepper out.